So it looks to me now like everyone has connected their audio at least. So hopefully you can all hear me. Welcome to our session, Yad Vashem Reflections, which will be led by Reverend Rob Whiteman of Dundee Unitarians. I'm going to hand over to him shortly to take the session, but just a couple of kind of practical housekeeping things. You may have noticed that you're all on mute. We've been doing that in most of the sessions to avoid a cacophony of sound and background noise. But Rob has asked if you have questions during his presentation, then feel free to just pop them in the chat box. And if they're questions to kind of clarify things that he's talking about, then he'll try and address them as he goes along. But then at the end, we'll also have a time for questions and answers then as well. So we'll use the chat box for that, which you can find at the bottom of your screen, just in the middle. It says chat. So if you click on that, you'll be able to ask any questions or clarifications. There's a couple of people still just joining us, but I think it's 3 minutes past 12. We should be prompt and punctual and get started. So I'm going to hand over to Rob now. Thanks very much.
Good morning, well, good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can all hear me. I'm going to talk over pictures, but I'll introduce that. I was originally asked to do this talk as I switched on my phone on landing at Heathrow after 10 days in Israel. In fact, Derek seems to have known I was in the air, because the first thing I did was switch on my phone, and there it was. So obviously he had secret knowledge. And the original plan of this session was to reflect on what I'd seen of the Israel-Palestine situation on the ground during my trip. That trip was last September. There was an Israeli general election the day after I arrived. There's since been another general election since I was there. So as you can see, the story has moved on. And if we'd all been in one room together, this would have been a different experience. I, for one, would have been able to read the room. I can't see most of you now. There are more here on the screen. Today, obviously, I don't have that luxury. And I plan to show a series of slides, and they will be shown, and I will talk over those slides. So I hope this will be the first one. And I think Rory has set this up so that there will be questions on the side, which I'm now struggling to find, but I'll continue to see if I can get those to appear. Anyway, I don't think I can see the questions, but we'll get to them at the end. This slide shows part of the barrier wall that was built starting in 2002, and I expect that most of you will have heard of it, and many of you will have strong views on it. I passed through it as we went on the road down from Jerusalem to Jericho and on to Masada and the Dead Sea, and this photo was taken on the way back. In discussion with people whom I met, including some leading academics, I was surprised that this wall was now welcomed as something that brought peace. There was no longer a threat of being daily blown up, and this seemed to be welcomed on all sides of those people I spoke to. And that observation leads me to my central point today. I should maybe give you a caveat. Obviously, I was there for 10 days. I spoke to a limited number of people. I was only in Jerusalem and then down to Jericho and the Dead Sea and Masada. This isn't a huge survey of everything. It's just what I saw and my responses. My central point today, the story changes. Interpretations change, and we, all of us, need to have our ears open to changing stories and situations. This is not simply true of Israel, Palestine, but of all things. If you think the same thing now as you did 20, 30, 40 years ago, 10 years ago, without having brought new information and thoughts to an issue, then that's a problem. In conversation on my trip, I was also struck by how much agreement there was as to where the solution to the problems there lay, far less so on how to get to that solution. And I've taken this section first, as I don't want to give the impression that it's not being considered, but also I'm not going to return to it at the end. In a room where we were all present, I might have done this the other way round, but in this format, I want to focus on my trip to Yad Vashem and what that can tell us about today. So I spent 10 days at Yad Vashem at a seminar run by the Council for Christians and Jews for church leaders, studying the Holocaust, or Shoah as it's referred to at Yad Vashem. 10 days might strike you as a long time. It wasn't. I would have welcomed much more, as I felt we only scratched the surface and there was so much to reflect on. I was recently at a CSRP, that's a Centre for the Study of Religion and Politics seminar here in St Andrews, looking at the theology of surveillance. And Dr. Stoddart, leading the seminar, focused on one chapter of his forthcoming book. Little plug for him here, that's available in January 2021 rather, from all good booksellers. Dr. Eric Stoddart, CSRP, I'm sure it'll be good. Anyway, he read a chapter and then he outlined the rest of the volume. And it will include a chapter on the Holocaust. So I asked him in that seminar why. And he outlined 3 covenants of the gaze of God: a covenant with Noah, the covenant of the Exodus, and the covenant of Golgotha. But he also said that there was a time when that gaze was missing. That gaze of God went astray, and he said that was the Holocaust. And that's why he said it's important to study it. And for us as Unitarians, it and the Holocaust and the First World War present huge theological challenges. Just think how absurd James Freeman Clarke and his ideas often look in their wake. The Shoah matters in any serious theological conversation. And today I want to reflect on my trip to Yad Vashem by looking at some of the buildings and memorials that have been built there and what I think they say. I'll say a little bit about each building or monument, supported by pictures. In doing this, I hope to share with you more of my experience there and my thoughts on the Shoah. But I also hope to raise some questions in your minds about the built environment and the current world around us. So let's start first with Yad Vashem. It means a memorial and a name. And that comes from Isaiah chapter 56, verse 5. I will give in my house and within my walls a monument and a name better than sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off. A memorial and a name. Yad Vashem, the 1953 Yad Vashem law of the Israeli Parliament established the Martyrs and Heroes Remembrance Authority, whose aim is the commemoration in the homeland of all those members of the Jewish people who gave up their lives or rose up and fought the Nazi enemy and its collaborators. And, again quoting from that law, to set up a memorial to them and to the communities, organisations and institutions that were destroyed because they belonged to Jewish people. And the site first opened to the public in 1957. Over the years, new memorials and other buildings have been added to the site. The whole site forms part of Mount Herzl. The top part of that hill hosts the Israeli National Cemetery. On the Sunday I was there, I went and walked around the cemetery in the morning when we had some free time. It has a number of sections, including one for prime ministers and presidents, as well as the grave of Herzl himself, the founder of Zionism, on the very top of the hill, looking towards the old town of Jerusalem. Yad Vashem is on a spur of the main hill. The first monument that I want to discuss is the Hall of Remembrance, and you can see that picture there of the inside of it, opened in 1961. The walls are made from basalt boulders brought from the area surrounding the Sea of Galilee, and an angular roof that gives it its tent-like shape. You can't quite see that in this picture. Engraved on the mosaic floor are the names of 22 of the most infamous Nazi murder sites, symbolic of the extermination and concentration camps, transit camps, and killing sites that existed throughout Europe. The eternal flame, burning from a base fashioned like a broken bronze goblet, continuously illuminates the hall, its smoke exiting the building through an opening at the highest point of the ceiling. Before it stands a stone crypt. You just see that in front with the wreath on it, containing the ashes of Holocaust victims brought to Israel from the extermination camps. A focal point of commemoration to this day, the Hall of Remembrance serves as Yad Vashem's premier site for memorial ceremonies. When dignitaries visit, this is where they go to lay their wreaths, to speak, etc. You're allowed to take photos in the hall, but asked to remain silent. And I should say a bit about the photos. Most of the photos you'll see today were taken by me. Those that were not are in the public domain and come from parts of the site where you're specifically asked not to take photos. And there's one exception to that, which is the plan of the Valley of the Communities, which we'll get to. In fact, we'll get to it now. The Valley of Communities was opened in 1992. It draws its inspiration from Ezekiel chapter 37, verses 1 and 5. The hand of the Lord was upon me, and carried out in the spirit of the Lord, and set me down in the midst of the valley which was full of bones. Thus said the Lord God unto these bones, Behold, I will cause breath to enter into you, and you shall live. So that's a picture of one part of the Valley of the Communities. And at the top of the walk down to the valley, there's this tree. It's a recent addition. And if you look closely, hopefully you've got a good enough screen, you can see that the branches are made up of people. And I think this photo maybe shows it a little more clearly. It's a memorial to the partisans who fought against the Nazis in the occupied countries. Again, it's a fairly new addition. There's then a long walk down the hill to the valley that's dug out of the natural bedrock. Over 5,000 names of communities are engraved on the stone walls in the Valley of the Communities. Each name recalls a Jewish community which existed for hundreds of years. For the inhabitants, each community constituted an entire world. Today, in most cases, nothing remains but the name. And this picture, as you can see there on the right, has Warsaw is the name, the big thing you can see on the right, and the huge big communities are written in big letters. The valley was excavated out of the earth. Nothing was built above the ground. It was if what had been built up on the surface of the earth over the course of the millennium, 1,000 years of Jewish communal life, was suddenly swallowed up. The names of the communities are engraved on 107 walls, which roughly corresponds to the geographical arrangement of the map of Europe and North Africa, and that's a plan of the original, obviously taken from above. At the entrance to the valley is the inscription. This memorial commemorates the Jewish communities destroyed by Nazi Germany and its collaborators, and the few which suffered but survived in the shadow of the Holocaust. For more than 1,000 years, Jews lived in Europe, organizing communities to preserve their distinct identity in periods of relative tranquility. Jewish culture flourished, but in periods of unrest, Jews were forced to flee. Wherever they settled, they endowed the people amongst whom they lived with their talents. Here, their stories will be told. That's at the entrance. And the site, as you can probably see from that plan, is a bit of a maze. It's also a bit disorientating, a theme that we'll come back to. If you're in one section, you cannot hear people next door, even though they're only a few feet away, but you're always open to the freedom of the sky. And I think that the plants are deliberately allowed to grow. The next three memorials and buildings I want to discuss were all designed by a chap called Moshe Savdi. I apologize for my pronunciation. There'll be a few names that I won't get right. An Israeli architect. The Children's Memorial, number 10 here, was completed in 1987, and it commemorates the 1.5 million children murdered by the Nazis, out of a total of 6 million. A quarter were children. I'll give you very few numbers, but that one is truly shocking. A quarter, 1.5 million out of 6 million, were children. And we heard how children were deliberately rounded up and sent off. Many of them died alone. Yet the memorial does not dwell on that. You are asked not to take pictures inside, and indeed, they would make no sense, as this again is a disorientating monument. I'm going to assume that none of you are going to visit. Certainly, you're not going to be visiting anytime soon. If I thought you were going to visit, I would not try to describe what I experienced, as that might take it away from you. So, as you can see, there's an entrance. On top, you've got a number of pillars, obviously broken off, representing children whose life were not completed. And you can see at the right-hand side of the picture, there's an entrance. It takes you a slope, and you go down that and turn left into a dark corridor. On the left are these faces. Again, I should say this isn't my picture. You're not allowed to take them inside. And you then turn, you go further down and turn left again into the dark. And it takes a while to work out where you are. There are lights around you, but you cannot make any sense of where you are. There is a voice saying names in Yiddish, Hebrew, and English of children, along with their age and where they came from. Slowly, you work out that the whole thing is a smoked glass hall of mirrors. In reality, there are only 5 candle points of light, but it feels like many, many more. The whole thing's laid out as a diamond. The names go on. I walked around it several times. You then emerge onto a terrace, looking towards the hills of Judah. This is an overview with the columns broken above the chamber. You can see there the slope going down, and you turn left. Move now to the museum. And that's a plan of the site. The museum was opened in 2005, replaced an early museum that had focused on Auschwitz. It's a stunning building. It's a 180-meter long triangle driven through the hillside at the heart of the site. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but that's it, up and down there. It goes straight through the hillside. The overhang at the entrance end represents the precariousness of the pre-war Jewish communities. And you walk in along what you can see is a walkway, and turn left and see a video cut together from clips from those communities. There's a very poignant 2 young girls who just stand there waving at you. You then double back and you walk through the hill. But you cannot go in a straight line. You weave back and forwards across the triangle to exhibitions in various rooms about aspects of the Shoah. You can't take shortcuts. There are sort of trenches with things in it and various bits that stop you taking shortcuts. And you can see that from that view down there, you have to go backwards and forwards through the triangle. Again, it's very disorientating, and you go on a chronological journey. You can't take photos inside, so these are from their website, as are the photos from the end of the Hall of Names, the last chamber. And around the outside are folders, and you can see some of those. It's a whole circle, and you can see that you stand on that glass podium to give you some idea of quite how tall it is. You cannot reach the cone above you. So it's actually, this is a big, tall room. And those folders of cards each have a name and as much information as possible on it. You remember, the whole place is built on the idea of a monument and a name from Isaiah. In the middle is an open-topped cone. You can just see the edge of it on the left-hand edge of this picture. And there's a fuller picture there. There are pictures going up the cone, and below is a deep bare pit in the rock. And again, as you leave the museum, it opens up into a stunning view out into the hills of Judah. That one just gives you the first view, and this one gives you a better sense of how the whole thing opens up. Another memorial is the memorial to the deportees. You may have seen this before. And to a great extent, it speaks for itself. The carriage was bought from Poland. And on the wall below, the following is written, one side of the tracks in English, one side in Hebrew. And it's a quotation from In a Cattle Car to the Death Camp, the testimony of a survivor by Avram Krispicki. Over 100 people were packed into our cattle car. It's impossible to describe the tragic situation in an airless closed car. Everyone tried to push his way to a small air opening. I found a crack in one of the floorboards into which I pushed my nose to get a little air. The stench in the cattle car was unbearable. People were defecating in all four corners of the car. After some time, the train suddenly stopped. A guard entered the car. He'd come to rob us. He took everything that had not been well hidden: money, watches, valuables, water. We pleaded with the railroad workers. We would pay them well. I paid 500 zlotys and received a cup of water, about half a litre. As I began to drink, a woman whose child had fainted attacked me. She was determined to make me leave her a little water. I did leave a bit of water at the bottom of the cup and watched the child drink. The situation in the cattle car was deteriorating. The car was sweltering in the sun. The men lay half naked. Some of the women lay in their undergarments. People struggled to get some air, and some no longer moved. The train reached the camp. Many lay inert on the cattle car floor. Some were no longer alive. And that's on the walls, if you like, from where, just below from where we're viewing. And the cattle car itself, as you can see, goes out. And I find this a very powerful image. The ragged, shattered, broken end of the tracks, but also the view beyond. And this gives you a sense of how it just hangs there, but also, again, a view beyond it. And that's one of the more modern monuments. As you will have seen, the style of the buildings has changed over the years. And I think this has been driven by a change in understanding. The first building was defined by the awfulness of the Shoah, and as a memorial solely to those who were murdered. It's covered in the names of the camps and has ashes from them. None of the others have either of those. There are no ashes anywhere else. There are no names of camps. Instead, the other monuments talk of individual people and Jewish communities, and all end with a sense of hope, a view of the new Jewish homeland and community, often an actual panorama. I don't think that change is a coincidence. It reflects a mature understanding of the Shoah and a realization that it did not succeed. Out of all that death, terror and horror came something better and a hope of more. Judaism, and by extension, life itself, cannot be extinguished. That's what I think it's saying. The buildings and monuments are very powerful, and I urge you to go. Go for as long as possible. And I know the number of people who are watching this have been, and I hope that that's touched some of their memories in what they've seen. I don't know how long anybody spent there, but 10 days wasn't enough. And when you've been, and hopefully you will go, to reflect on what you've seen and how it applies to our life today, how it cannot but inform our theology. And at that point, I want to stop and I'll try to pick up some of the questions in the comment section. And I think I haven't been able to see the comment section during this, but I know that Rory's been monitoring, so perhaps he can try and field the questions. We'll try and do a brief question and answer between us, and then I'm sure everyone will be ready for lunchtime.
So I think that people have been watching the photos, so there's no questions in the chat box yet. So I'm going to suggest that if people do have questions, they pop them in there now while we're talking. And I'm going to use my position as someone that's unmuted to ask you an initial question, Rob, if that's okay.
Okay. I can also now see the box, which helps.
Great. Okay. Firstly, I just want to thank you for that very powerful and evocative and moving talk. I have been to Yad Vashem, and it really took me back and made me feel a bit the way that I felt when I was there, which is a powerful thing to do. So thank you for that. I wanted to ask you a question, or just ask you to maybe tell us a bit more about I think that the trip that you went on was organised by the Council of Christians and Jews. So I just wondered if you could tell us a bit about maybe the work that they do, or like this trip specifically, like why is that organised, and what's the purpose and how does it work and that kind of thing.
Okay, I think they've been running this for about 15 years, and I heard about it pretty much as soon as it started, and I'd always wanted to go. It just struck me as a fascinating thing to reflect on the Shoah, the Holocaust, as such an important part of, of where we are today, an important part of theological reflection. I went with a very varied group. There were about 20 of us. It was 10 days. There were people from all over the UK. They were from a number of traditions. It was supposed to be church leaders, but they were also church educators. So there were people who were directors of education for dioceses in England, directors of the schools, directors of religious education for that. There were a couple of people who were in training to be usually priests. For some reason, the Church of England Eastern Training authorities have very much got hold of it, and their director was there and a couple of their students. Quite a few Methodists. There was one Roman Catholic female educator from Birmingham. So we were quite a diverse collection, ranging in age from about 30 through to probably 60. Not much more than that, obviously, because you had to be working. And the idea is very much that you learn and then you pass on that sort of knowledge. I've used what I learnt in a number of services in Dundee. I've also been to Glasgow and done a service. The Council for Christians and Jews, I think, was set up just after the war, and is a way of trying to encourage dialogue between Christians and Jews. And it's it has a number of sort of patrons who are, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Archbishop of Westminster, and the Chief Rabbi, and these sorts of things. But it runs a lot of seminars for Christian Jewish discussion, for education, not just on the Holocaust, but across general matters, and also for, I think they have particular work in students and campuses. But I'm aware that Cody Coyne, I don't know if he's with us, he went on this at one point. I think I was the first Unitarian to go for a number of years. That was certainly very well received. People were very interested to hear what Unitarianism was about and be part of that discussion. I would commend it to anybody. It's highly subsidized. I was also lucky. I applied for the Jane Barraclough scholarship, and that very much supported it. I would encourage anybody to go. I'm happy to talk at a later date with anybody who's interested in going. Even if you're not in a position to be part of that seminar, I would encourage you to go. I think it's a wonderful site. Even if you're not particularly interested in the Shoah, just those monuments and those buildings say a lot.
Thank you. we just, in the chat section, Maud has just said that she's submitted her application to go. So you're obviously encouraging other people to take that opportunity, which is great. There's a couple of questions. I don't know if you want me to read them out or if you can see them yourself. I'm happy to read them out. Is that easier?
Well, let me just have a look. So the present conflict with the Palestinians, I don't know who Deborah Law is.
I think that you joined the meeting after you had talked about that. So that
right. So obviously that was at the beginning,
yeah.
And I did speak about that. So whilst we can move on from that, Matthew, I assume is Matthew Smith. Do you have a sense of how Israelis today feel about the failures of the church during the mid-20th century? Does the Jewish community feel that Christians, Europeans, are seeking to learn the lessons? And I don't particularly have a sense about that. Obviously, the seminar was 10 days long, and there was just an absolute wall of information. There was some discussion about that, but I'm certainly aware that the Vatican have recently opened up their archive about the work of Pope Pius during the Second World War, and I hope that we'll discover a lot more from that about what went on. So that was not a centre of our discussion, and in the people I was speaking to, that didn't come up. I suppose as I was part of a Council for Christians and Jews discussion, the fact that people were talking would have slightly have gone across that, and that wasn't the focus of it. So I didn't really get a strong sense of that, because that wasn't really the focus of what we were trying to do. Sorry if that doesn't help Matthew's question, but I don't really feel I've got a particular answer to that question.
Maybe while people are thinking if they have any questions, I've got another question for you, if that's okay.
Of course.
And that is about, I know only a little bit really about the role that Unitarians played during the Holocaust and Second World War in trying to help people that were able to escape from Nazi Europe, people like Rosalind Lee in particular. And I get the sense that that doesn't feel like a part of our history that's particularly often talked about, although I have read about it in the Inquirer. We've got Colleen here, and it does feature in our history, but it doesn't seem like a really prominent thing that we celebrate that Unitarians did something to try and help. So I wondered about that, and then also related to that, if you think that maybe how Unitarians reacted to the Holocaust can in any way kind of help us dealing with some of the different but also difficult things that we're facing in today's world.
Obviously this year is the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, and that would seem to be a wonderful opportunity for Colleen, and I would have thought for the Unitarian Historical Society to maybe look a bit more at that. I know that Alan Ruston did a lot on the centenary of the First World War to pick that up, and I wonder whether various historians are working on that. So I'm not kind of focused particularly on that. As to the lessons to be learnt from it, I think the lessons for us all are huge, and just our idea of where God was in this, and the idea that Eric brought up, Dr. Stoddart, about God's gaze being elsewhere and how that reflects on our idea of covenant. I know for a lot of people it's hugely important in their understanding of the problem of evil, and that I think for each of it we all have to reflect on it for ourselves in how that has particularly worked. I see that Sheila Evans has written Norbert Chapek, obviously, who died in Dachau, and there will be many examples of people. Yeah, he's probably the most prominent example I can think of, someone who died there. The effect, and I think I saw a discussion on this on Facebook and with Robin Hanford and various other people, the effect of the Holocaust, the Shoah, the Second World War on liberal religions in general, and I know that Andrew Hill has a view on that, was clearly quite strong. We don't do well in times of when those sort of things are focused and brought into sharp relief, and the problem of evil. It's not, if you like, playing into our strengths. And I wonder whether that discussion, and I don't know if Robin's part of it, will be helpful to that. There was something else I thought of, but that train has left the thought station. So unless there are any more, I'll take any more questions. There was something else that you put up, that train has left the station.
Well, there's no more questions appearing in the chat.
Okay.
I'm going to look through the screens and see if anybody's waving and can't use the chat, but no, I think, there is a question or a comment from Anne Piet.
Yeah. Yes. Obviously, that's part of, there's that wonderful Kindertransport memorial outside Liverpool Street Station, the Kindertransport, and obviously Unitarians will have been involved individually. And hopefully that's something that the Unitarian Historical Society and other people could take on, you know, with the 75th anniversary. I just don't know particularly much about it, and therefore I can't add particularly to that. But perhaps that's a scope for people to take that on. But certainly I would commend going to Yad Vashem, reflecting on the Holocaust. But also I think that what I've tried to bring out today, that the story changes. And it's clear, just reading about what's happened when I was there, the first I think it was the general election last September, the people I was talking to were very, very excited about Benny Gantz being possibly moving into power, but they were also excited about some of the Arab parties who'd never been prepared to go into government with the Jewish party starting to consider that, and that's obviously gone further since. I would say one, and this is a completely possibly left field thing, the chap who ran the seminar from Yad Vashem was a chap called Yiftach Miri. And he told us on one of the first nights we were there about the football team he supported, and which is a community-owned club that was a communist football team. In Britain, we have a sort of tradition of a lot of football teams that are religiously related. In Israel, they're politically related, and different parties ally themselves with different teams. This was a communist team. They had a fantastic logo of a duck, a cartoon duck. One of their early supporters, who sadly passed on, was a cartoonist, and he'd done a cartoon duck, and in front of this was a hammer and sickle, which was the sort of the team badge. And we discovered that because we had evenings off, we only worked from 8:30 in the morning till 6 at night. We had a couple of evening lectures as well, but we had evenings off, and I worked out that it was about a half-hour walk to the stadium, and we worked out they were playing a match one night. So we went, a number of us went along and watched Hapoel Katamon Jerusalem against Petah Tikva, Petah Tikva from elsewhere, in an enormous 30,000 seater stadium. And we'd said to the chap, we're coming along, and he said, hopefully we might see you. And he said, not a problem, we don't fill the stadium, we always go and sit at the end that Katamon are attacking, and then at half time we move to the other end because there are enough seats you can sit wherever you want. And we bumped into him. But one of the great things was they had, in the middle, they had a sort of, as you expect, the sort of ultras who had their duck, hammer and sickle, but an enormous number of rainbow gay pride flags were waved as well, which I'd never seen at a football match. So this was a very sort of liberal club. And this was a chap who was leading our seminar, who was a very liberal. I think that the number of the lectures we got in were very much from the academic left. There was a chap called Eval Nave, who spoke to us actually one evening. We couldn't do this on the Yad Vashem site, but back in the hotel, about the current political situation. And he'd written a wonderful book saying there are two narratives, and they were written on two sides of a page, and in the middle was a huge empty space. And so in terms of publishing, it was ridiculous, because at least half the page was empty. A huge empty space between them, saying these two narratives need to talk to each other across the space. I've seen that he's been a visiting lecturer at Harvard and a number of other places. So Eval Nave, if you want to follow that up. We did, going back to that lady before, we did try to engage and hear from what was going on as much as we could, but that wasn't the focus of our trip. And certainly we went to a synagogue on the Friday evening, and we then had dinner we all split up in pairs to go for dinner with families of people in the synagogue, and obviously that came up in discussion, as you'd expect over dinner there. The comment, let's have a look at Daniel's comment. The comment that God's grace was elsewhere is remarkably forgiving. How much of any of the work of the centre looks at the impact on the Jewish faith? Hugely. They've got there's an enormous amount of academic work going on there, and that at Yad Vashem, obviously there's a museum, but there's an enormous amount of research going on, academics and education programs. There was a whole separate building we were in, where we were for 10 days, and we weren't the only seminar room. I think there were probably 4 or 5 seminar rooms. And one slightly off-putting thing was that if you start your Israeli National Service, you have to go along for, I think it's 1 or 2 days training at Yad Vashem before you do it. And so we had a number of conscripts, male and female, walking around us in army uniforms. You went to the toilet, you walked past people with submachine guns. If you're doing your national service, you have a gun with you. And there were people carrying submachine guns with a magazine tucked in the back of their trousers, male and female. And that is quite off-putting. If you live in Britain, you're not used to walking into the gents and finding somebody standing next to you with a submachine gun. And they very much have to look after them. And that was quite off-putting. And Maud asked, can you speak a little about the discussions which happened? We had enormous number of lecturers come in. As a chap called Yehuda Bauer, who's well into his 90s now, who's one of the leading academics, was one of the founders of the academic sort of institutions at Yad Vashem. And he just spoke. So we had seminars by all sort of a huge number of leading academics and commentators in their fields. But I found him most interesting. He said, you should always start history from the story and from a person. And so almost all the seminars we had started by saying, there was this person, and telling you a story of somebody, sometimes people who survived, sometimes people who didn't, and actually anchoring it in real people. So it wasn't 6 million people. It was, we start from this story and we take that out. And we did that day after day. And that really was an education to say all history starts from a story. We start from a story. So a monument and a name, and starting from those names and trying to put it together. And there was a chap called Ringelblum in Warsaw who'd worked very, very hard, and he buried an enormous number of, they were buried in milk churns. I think they found 3 out of 4, they're thought to be 4, of records of what was going on in Warsaw. And they said, if nobody survives, we want these records to survive. And a lot of those records are now held at Yad Vashem, trying to put these stories together. Looking at Sarah's one. Yes, again, storytelling. Start from people's stories and go from there. And again, this chap, Eval Nave, the lecturer who came in to talk us about the current political situation, he was very much saying that people have to meet and tell each other their story. And his book with the 2 sides was about that. I'm going to have a sip of water. I feel I've been talking for a long time, so unless you've got a final question, Rory, I'm aware that I've got a loaf that's just come out of my bread maker. Thank you very much, Maud Robinson. And I probably want to go and eat a fresh, crusty loaf, or the crust off a fresh, crusty loaf. But Rory, have you got anything further you want to add, or any further questions?
I wouldn't want to get between you and your lunch, so I won't ask you any more questions today, but I might do in the future. Just thank you again for going on this trip and for sharing it with all of us in our virtual gathering here. So thank you very much, Rob. And I want to give you a round of applause, but everyone is on mute apart from me, I think. So I'll clap and make the noise, and there we go.
Thank you very much, everybody, and I'll see you soon in another place.
Great. Thank you. And thank you all for coming. Bye-bye.
Cheers.